Hello and welcome to the first session of Generative Structures, Reasons of Being and Reasons of Knowing. The instructor is Anna Longo. This seminar takes the question of philosophical systems and the conditions which allow for their autonomous construction. How can different philosophical architectures conserve their inner validity while addressing a variety of conceptual structures? Are we rationally allowed to believe in the productive power of reason? This seminar will try to answer these questions by dealing with different strategies for constructing philosophical systems since the beginning of modernity, Descartes, Leibniz, until present day, Meillassoux, Badiou, and passing through post and new Kantianism. Our particular attention will be dedicated to the articulation of the two series of the reasons of being, concerning the genesis of the real and the reasons of knowing, i.e., the conceptual formal structure of thought. A comparison is proposed between the philosophical and the mathematical creativity, Lautman, Cavaillès, and capacity of producing, in an autonomous and non-history dependent way, new domains and objects available for knowledge. The goal is to set the conditions to reflect upon the productive power of reason and on the real effects of the activity of thinking. Anna Longo is a doctor of aesthetics and teaches at the University of Paris, Pantheon-Sorbonne. Her research concerns the genesis of the conditions of experience at the crossroads of several disciplines: arts, mathematics, science. She has been the author and editor of several books, such as The Genesis of the Transcendental, 2017, Breaking the Spell, Speculative Realism Under Discussion, 2015, Time Without Becoming, 2014. She currently teaches at the Critical Studies Department, Cal Arts. I'll give the mic to Anna.
Thank you, Patrick. Hello to everybody. Welcome. First of all, I would like to know a little bit of you. I think that you are not all philosophers and maybe you have different interests. So I would like you to make a very short presentation of yourself, just to know about your interest, your formation, and just to be able to calibrate also the class according to your interest, your backgrounds. Just really short too. Is it possible to do this?
Yes, we always very often do this, and I think let's start from left to right, and the first person in my window is Alex. So I'll ask Alex, can you present a bit about yourself? Hi.
Hi, I'm Alex.
Hi, Alex.
I am an autodidact. I have studied philosophy for a number of years informally. My primary interests are philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics, and generally sort of a lot of the epistemic questions around methodology, statistics, probability, these sorts of things. And so I'm very interested in looking at the questions around philosophy of system that the Girault paper is discussing, and kind of exploring that within this broader context of history of philosophy. So that's what I'm looking at.
Thank you.
The next person in my list is Daryl. Daryl, can you present?
Hello, it's Daryl Campbell.
Hi, Daryl.
Hey, I work at Athabasca University. Although I'm not in philosophy, I work in IT. And but I'm like Alex, sort of taking this up on my own, and I've done quite a bit of reading on Badiou, Nietzsche, of course, and been studying the speculative realists over the last couple of months, and I've had a kind of a deep dive in Francois Leroux. Looking forward to it.
Okay.
The next person is
Thank you.
Is Edward. Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. Hi.
Hi. Edward Gomo. I've done work in continental philosophy at the New School, Fordham, and Marquette University in Wisconsin, mainly on Heidegger and Nietzsche. Also taught for 7 or 8 years, mainly in ethics. And this week's readings were particularly in the arc of the course that I can see in terms of the history of philosophy. My own philosophical writing and output came to a halt when I entered a history of philosophy program. So I'm hopeful that this course can sort of help me to begin to write again. This is why I became part of the program.
Okay, thank you.
Next person in my list is Hernan. Hernan, can you present a bit about yourself?
Sure, no problem. Hello, can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. So my name is Hernan Blumenthal. I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina. My formal training is in biochemistry, and so I'm quite new to critical philosophy. I'm enrolled in the new center as in the critical philosophy program, and I'm still mapping the philosophical terrain. So I'm trying to get a grasp of the breadth of what we're doing. But yeah, so I'm particularly interested in the problem of the mathematical intelligibility of natural phenomena. That's how I stumbled with a philosophical issue during my scientific practice. So yeah, I'm trying to work around that. Yep.
Great, thank you.
The next person would be Joseph. Hello, Joseph. I see you a bit. Can you unmute yourself?
Hey,
Perfect.
can you hear me?
Perfect, yes.
Hey,
Hi.
sorry, my schedule's in and out. Yeah, so I have a background in media studies for my bachelor's, starting a master's program in an English department at University of Nebraska. And there I'm really interested in learning about technological history and philosophy, continental philosophy mainly. And I'm really interested in sort of representation and experience and the role that technology plays in those concepts. So yeah, I'm really interested to learn a lot outside of continental philosophy in this course and through this program with critical philosophy at the New Center.
Thank you.
Next person on my list is Kate. Hello, Kate.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. I come from a background in contemporary art, so I am currently working in an art gallery and like, you know, putting together exhibitions and you know, dealing with artists and museums and things like that. Currently getting ready to go to Buenos Aires, so hold on, it's funny hearing you there now. And I am trying to develop my curatorial practice and doing more things independently. And I think it's really important to not get so distracted by kind of the logistics of things, which is so much of my day-to-day life. And I found myself lacking in a philosophical grounding. I studied literature, and so it's always been something that I've studied in tandem with things and never really just on its own. So I'm really excited to kind of go deeper a little bit into that.
Thank you.
Next person on my list is Lauren. You're muted. If you want me to unmute you, then...
No, I can do it. Sorry, I just, I didn't realize that was how that worked. Hi, I'm Lauren.
Hi.
I use they, them pronouns or he, him pronouns. And I'm based in Berlin, but I'm from the US. I currently am employed through a research lab in critical computing, working on a project around cyberfeminism and new materialism. But I have an arts background. I have a master's in painting. And in my art studio work, I work with transgender archives and I think a lot about material. So I'm curious to see what this course can bring for me. I'm not sure yet. So, but I'm curious.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next person on my list, and also the last, is Neil. Hello, Neil.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, I'm based in Canada, Waterloo, Ontario. My background is in communication and media studies. I'm basically sort of generally interested in computing as a medium. And so I sort of came to this basic conceptual framework that the course is sort of proposing through Simondon, who talks about kind of the relationship between knowing and being. And so just on the basis of that, I signed up in order to sort of get a better grounding in kind of what the stakes are in that philosophical question.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, so are these all the presentations? So thank you, welcome. I'm really excited to do this class with you. So we have a lot of different profiles, different backgrounds, which is great. So if there are questions, you can interrupt and ask questions. So don't worry if you need more explanation or if you want to bring something up, like, for example, share your point of view, your experience, or your knowledge also, because you are covering domains that I do not cover. So it will be interesting also to enlarge the inquiry to other fields or other problems. So that will be good for everybody, I think, so to take advantage of the diversity. So first, I think some issue about the organization. So we will have 4 classes any Saturday until the end of April. The 2 last weeks, 2 last Saturdays, are the days also for your presentations. So I think that there are kind of 10, 11 people enrolled. So I was thinking of having kind of 5 presentations on the 3rd week and 5 presentations on the last week, to have time also to finish the readings. So what I proposed to you is to write an essay. It will be a final essay that we will have to submit, I think, 3 weeks after the end of the classes, of the seminar. So your presentation will be a sort of first draft of your final essay. In this way, we will be able to discuss about it. You will discuss this, of course, with me, but also with the discussant, which will be the respondent will be there for any presentation. So you will have a possibility to improve your project for the final essay. So I would need to make a list of the presentation by next week in order to be ready for the 3rd and 4th week. So I think that you can contact me by email during this week, writing me which is the topic that you like. I think that you can pick one of the topic from the list, from the syllabus, and then develop it according to your interests. So I would need by the end of this week, so before next Saturday, an email by you with the topic you are interested in and the day which is suitable for your presentation. So if you prefer the 3rd week or the 4th week, knowing that it will be better to have 5 and 5. So we will try to arrange this, and also to have respondents for any presentation. My email address is Anna longo@newcenter.org. So it will be easy to contact me and to tell me about the date for your presentation. And then next Saturday, first of all, we will check the list, and so everything will be organized before the day of the presentations. The final essay, I think it will be kind of 2,000 words, but we can discuss this further. Also, personally, depending on your interest and what you are like to do. So we will see case by case about your final essay. Okay, so any other question about this kind of general organization? Is it okay?
I do. How long would you like the presentations to be? Like, I guess we should keep them kind of short.
Yeah, presentation must be just 10 minutes.
Okay.
10 minutes presentation and 5 minutes for the respondent. So just a draft of your project. And then we will try to ask you questions and make suggestions. Okay, so let's start. So the title that I chose concerns with reasons of being and reasons of knowing. So this will be the central concept of our seminar. So I took these expressions, reasons of knowing and reasons of being, from Marshall Guerreau. We are going to talk about Marshall Guerreau later, just to explain these key concepts. But I'm using actually Marshall Guerreau perspective on the philosophy of the history of philosophy in order to go through different philosophical systems. So we will explain first these notions of reasons of being and reasons of knowing. We will see how Marshall Guerreau elaborates methodology, a philosophical methodology using these two notions. And this is to explain the worth of philosophy. So to explain what a philosophical production is. And then we will see how different philosophers actually produce their systems according to reasons of being and reasons of knowing. So we will apply in some way Marshall Guerreau methodology to different philosophies in order to explain how these systems are constructed. And we will see that there are two main ways of constructing philosophical systems. One is starting from reasons of knowing, and the other is starting from reasons of being. But we need both of them. So we will see how they are articulated and what does it mean to have a system which is starting from reason of being, and what does it mean to have a system which is starting from reasons of knowing. And we will see that this can apply also to mathematics. So concerning mathematics, we will have examples of Albert Lautman and Jean Cavaillès, and a discussion by Herman Dale. So the problem basically for mathematics is to explain how or why mathematics can be applied to physics. So mathematics usually is developed according to reasons of knowing. So it's a logical system, deductive system, which is not interested usually in things which are outside mathematics. But then we have the problem of understanding why we can use mathematics in order to describe reality. So this is the problem which is encountered by Jean Cavaillès, Albert Lautman, and Hermann Weyl. So we will discuss this problem of the articulation of being and the formal structure within mathematics. Of course, we will have Badiou because of his formal ontology. It will be at the end. And we will talk about Jules Vuillemont. So Jules Vuillemont is another French philosopher who wrote this book, What Are Philosophical Systems? And he makes a sort of classification of philosophical systems. He's considered as the person who made this first connection between continental and analytic philosophy, at least in France. So there is another very interesting book by Jules Vuillemont, but it has not been translated into English, which is The Philosophy of Algebra, which I think is one of the most wonderful books. But we have many of these ideas also in What Are Philosophical Systems. So today we will start by Marshall Guéraud. So just to really understand these concepts of reasons of being and reasons of knowing with examples. The example is the system Descartes systems. And in the second week, which is next week, we will see just the post-Kantian and the neo-Kantian way of constructing philosophical systems. So the problem, just as a point of departure, the main problem is the skepticism about Kant's transcendental philosophy. So, you know, there was a classical skepticism. Classical skepticism is about the impossibility of an absolute truth. So it's about saying, okay, everything you say is said by you. So it's your subjective viewpoint. So this is classical skepticism. And we have an example in David Hume's philosophy. So according to Hume, we can construct ideas, abstract ideas about reality, and we can think of laws which allow us to make prediction of the future. But we will never know if they are really true or not. So it is possible to make the experience of something which is contradicting the law. That's because empiricism is based on experience, and experience is always our experience. So experience is always limited to the occurrences. So in order to be absolutely certain about the truth, you will need an infinite number of experiences, which is impossible. So this is the first kind of skepticism, which is based on the impossibility of assessing the correspondence between representation and reality. After Kant criticism, we have a new kind of skepticism. So we know that Kant introduced this Copernican revolution. So he said, okay, it doesn't matter if representation is subjective, because we can say that even if it is subjective, it is universal. So since we can produce a representation which is valid for everybody, so for any rational being. We don't care if this representation corresponds to reality or not, because it's objective, and it's objective because it's produced according to universal rules. So the old skepticism cannot apply anymore, because the old skepticism said, okay, representation is subjective. But Kant said, okay, even if it's subjective, it doesn't matter, because we have universal rules, transcendental, a priori concepts. So the new kind of skepticism is a sort of transcendental skepticism. So according to the new skepticism, we don't know why we are using some categories rather than others. So the problem in Kant is that he says, okay, there are some a priori, there is a transcendental structure, and we have to apply this. But there is no real demonstration of the necessity of a transcendental. So according to Kant, this demonstration is not possible, because you cannot consider the transcendental as an empirical object. So it's not possible to make an inquiry on the transcendental itself. So it is ungrounded. It's just posited as it was necessary, but is not proven as necessary. So the new skeptic says, why are you using some categories rather than others? And this is, for example, the problem that you find in Meillassoux. For example, when Meillassoux says that there is no necessity of the natural laws, is actually saying there is no necessity for the transcendental structure according to which nature is described. So this is the operator of the new skepticism. So to overcome this problem, which is the problem of grounding or explaining the genesis of a transcendental, in order to show that the categories are necessary and not just posited in an arbitrary way, one has to show the genesis of where they come from and why they are necessary, so why we cannot change them. And also, this means that accessing this principle, which is the principle allowing for the genesis of the transcendental, of the conditions of knowledge, this principle grounds also the reality. So since accessing the principle of a genesis of a transcendental means to access thought in itself, as it is in itself, or the subject as thing in itself. This means that we are accessing the principle of a genesis not only of thought as a thing in itself, but things in itself in general. So it's a problem of access to something which is the principle allowing for thought and being. So it's the principle allowing for the genesis of thought and reality as a correlate. So here we have a first sketch of what are the reasons of knowing and what are the reasons of being. The reasons of knowing are all the chain of reflections that you need in order to thought to grasp its own origin, or is itself as a thing in itself. So the reason of knowing is this sort of reflection where thought, analyzing itself, grasp its own necessity, or the principle of itself, its own essence. And the reasons of being are the reason of the structuration of the structure of being, which are connected in a certain way with the principle of the origin of thought, because thought and things, thought and being are beings. So the reasons of being are the reason why reality is such that can be known. So we have this question, which is a double question, is not only knowing or representing reality, but knowing why we are able to know. So knowing why reality is such that it can be known. And reality is also the reality of thought. Of course, this entails that philosophy is autonomous, because in this kind of circle where it grasps the conditions for knowing, and it posits at the same time the condition of the structure of reality, philosophy is constructing a sort of circle, which makes philosophy the autonomous construction of reality. So we are interested in philosophical systems as system of autonomous construction of reality. But then we have a problem. So if a philosophical system is a system which produces posited a reality, which is positive in a way that it can be known by the characteristic of thought, which are described or which are established by philosophy. We add that any philosophy must be true. So any philosophy as a philosophical system which is autonomous, which is positing the conditions of knowing and the conditions of being in a way that produce certainty about knowledge. So in a way in which so we can be sure that what we know is reality, so that what we know is true. We have a problem once we recognize that there are many different philosophies. So what do we do? Of course, we have the Hegelian solution. The Hegelian solution, Hegelian solution consists in make of any philosophy just one philosophy. So all the history of philosophy, all the different philosophies of the past are but different steps of the understanding of the knowledge of the only real philosophy, which is the Hegelian philosophy. So the history of philosophy is actually the development of just one philosophy. If we don't want to accept this solution, and we want to allow for not only to recognize the autonomy of any philosophical system, but if we want to produce new philosophy after Hegel, we have to understand how it's possible that any philosophy is expressing a truth, and that there are many philosophies which are true. So our problem is this articulation of the history of philosophy and the validity of any philosophy. And we will see that the coherence between the reasons of knowing and the reasons of being provides us with a criteria to understand the value of any singular system. because the analysis of the coherence between reasons of knowing and reasons of being allows us to understand the solidity of a system and to understand, to grasp the inner value of a system itself. And in this way, we will be able to understand the validity and the value of philosophies of the past. And we will be able to have a sort of methodology to produce new philosophy. So this is, in a really general way, what we are going to do to deal with in this seminar. Do you have questions for the moment? Okay, so we can start with Marshall Guéraud, just to re-understand his methodology, his perspective, and the application of his methodology. So we start, well, first a little introduction. So Marshall Guéraud is a French philosopher. Is a little bit unknown. It has not been translated so much in English, but it's forgotten also in France, in a way. So Marshall Guéraud, so it was very important for the development of Deleuze philosophy. I don't know if we will have the time to see this. He was a student of this Léon Brunswick. Léon Brunswick was also the professor of Albert Lautman and Jean Cavaillès. So Guéraud, Lautman, and Cavaillès, even though they have kind of different philosophical interests, they are all students of this Professor Léon Brunswick, who interpreted German idealism in terms of mathematics. So he said the real production of thought, the most important productivity of thinking is exhibited by mathematics. So he had this structural approach. So structuralism, French structuralism, will derive from these reflections. Trying to find the dates. Okay, so was born in 1891 and he died in 1976. So he was a professor of philosophy in Strasbourg, then in Sorbonne, and at the Collège de France. And in the Collège de France, he created this special position, and he called his position as history and technology of philosophical systems. So he was trying to introduce this new discipline, this new philosophical discipline, which is the history and technology of philosophical system. History and technology, because for Marshall Guéraud, the history of philosophy is a sort of history of technology, of the construction of philosophical systems. So his way of approaching the history of philosophy is a way of studying the technology for the construction of philosophical systems. So any philosophical system is like a machine. So I've been writing a book for all life, which is called Generative, and he never achieved it. So I think, but now just half of it is published in French, and the rest is unpublished. He never finished it, and is well known because of his monographies. So he wrote some monographies on Descartes, and we are going to see it as a kind of example of the application of his methodology. One about Fichte, Maimon, and Spinoza. And so the Guérault's monographies on Maimon and Spinoza are really, really important for the development of Deleuze philosophy. So, for example, you know that Deleuze is referring a lot to Maimon's philosophy. But at that time, Maimon was not translated into French. So the only source was Marshall Guérault's monography on Maimon. And also the interpretation of Spinoza, but Deleuze's interpretations of Spinoza is coming from Marshall Guérault's interpretation of Spinoza. So all this kind of new Spinozism, a new interest for Spinoza, which is shared by continental philosophy at that time, is coming from Marshall Guérault's interpretation, which is an interpretation of Spinoza as a system. And so we have a little review of Guérault's book on Spinoza by Deleuze in the syllabus. I think that I put it in, I upload it. I don't know if we will have the time to read it, but anyway, we will understand a lot about the philosophy of Deleuze. It's a sort of way of understanding Deleuze beyond the vitalism, which is usually considered the key to understand his works. But we will see that actually he's really interested in this rational construction, but starting from the reason of being rather than starting from the reason of knowing. So we will see the opposition between these two ways of constructing systems. Okay, so first of all, we see the text by Marshall Guérault. I don't know if you read it or not, but we are going through the text very quickly, just to see the main, most important points or passages. I try to share my screen. Okay. Yes. Okay, do you see the text?
Perfectly.
Okay. So the text starts by saying the history of philosophy has only recently become a problem for philosophy. And so this required that philosophy reflect on the works it had created and which it acknowledged as its own. So it's a way of making a philosophy of philosophies. And then he's quoting Hegel, of course. The all of Minerva takes flight only when the shades of night are falling. So the reason why it's important to make this philosophy of a history of philosophy is, according to Guérault, the necessity of answering in a different way the question which Hegel asked. So in Hegel, you know that philosophy is a reflection on philosophy. So the history of philosophy is the unfolding of the idea of philosophy. So all the different philosophies of the past are but manifestations of the same truth, which is the absolute truth of philosophy. That means that there are no different philosophical systems, autonomous philosophical systems, but just the unfolding of absolute knowledge. So the problem is, what do I have to do if I want to create a new philosophy which is not Hegelian? What do I do with the history of philosophy if I want to deal with it in a different way? Although I know that history of philosophy is a reflection on philosophy. So this is a little bit the problem. So it's a sort of dialogue with Hegel. It's a way of finding an alternative to the sublation of a history of philosophy into philosophy, which was made by Hegel. So in Hegel, the problem is that there is no more history of philosophy, because the history of philosophy is not a discipline, it's not a science, historical science of philosophy, but it's philosophy in itself. So there is no history of philosophy, but the past of philosophy is just the manifestation in an approximative way of only truth of philosophy. So the problem is how one can arrive to justify philosophy as objects worthy of possible history. So we have to make this history of philosophy as a discipline, and the problem is how to justify that a philosophy worth of history. And we will see that this idea of the worth of philosophy is an issue of methodology. Okay, so now Dan is kind of acknowledging that the philosophy has changed. Of course, there is a history of philosophy, a past of philosophy, because philosophy changed, but also the relation between philosophy and its own history changed a lot. The first paragraph is just saying, okay, it's very difficult because the relation between philosophy and its history changed a lot. So we have to take into account that relation of philosophy to its own history changed, but also that historiography changed. So there is a mutual determination between the way in which history is considered and the way in which philosophy is produced. So the change in historiography, in modifying the image of the past, conditions the change in philosophy's reaction to its past. And on the other hand, the changes of philosophy influence the profound changes in its historiography. So there are two problems. The first is the legitimacy and the validity of a history of philosophy as a science. And the second problem is about the legitimacy of philosophy independently on its history. So philosophy presents itself as a series of doctrines succeeding one another in time and swallowing up one another in the completed past. So the problem is how to reconcile the historicity of philosophy with the philosophical truth of all philosophy. And then how to define correlatively the concept of philosophical truth. The idea is that if any singular philosophy aim to be or to express an absolute truth, what do we do with a multiplicity of philosophy? So we cannot say that the truth of one system is automatically entailing the falsity of another philosophical system. So when we read Plato, for example, we are not saying that Plato has been falsified by Kant, for example, or that Kant has been falsified by Hegel. So we consider that there is a truth of these philosophies, even though their truths are contradictory. So we need to find a way to acknowledge the truth of any philosophy independently on the truth of other philosophies, but at the same time, if we want to make an history of philosophy, we need to show why any singular system works of history. So why they can be objects of history. So I skip a little bit because it's very long. So in this part is just discussing this sort of paradox of history and philosophy. Also because history wants to be a science and philosophy is not a science. So it's a way of saying, okay, there are two orders of truth, the historical truth and the philosophical truth. And this order of truths are not the same. So the historical truth consists in describing the past as it was, so a sequence of events, of past events. But the philosophical truth is different, so it concerns the coherence, internal coherence of a system. And for example, he says, okay, for science, okay, so here is that we cannot consider that philosophy is something of the past, but the truth of philosophy is a truth of the past, which is not valuable today. Here is kind of describing this kind of paradox a lot. And the differences between history of science and science. So Marchalguero says that the relation between history and philosophy is not the same that we find between history and science, because in science we have, of course, a history of science, but the history of science is the history of past truth, because the truth of science is the theory, the present theory of today, and the past theories are invalidated. So there is no problem. They can be just dead truth of the past, and there is no problem. And then science is not science of its own history. So there is no science of a history of science. There is history of science, but no science of a history of science. But this cannot be claimed about philosophy, because philosophy is always concerned with its past, and the past of philosophy is in a way alive in any new philosophy. So there is no dead truth of philosophy which is no more useful, which is just in the past, philosophy of the past. But any philosophy is considering the history of philosophy as something which is alive. So there is a philosophy which is concerned with its own past, although science is not concerned with its own past, with its own history. So the relation is different. Skip. And then we have another problem, which is the problem of a philosophy that usually, or it happened that philosophers said that we are not concerned with the history of philosophy. For example, Descartes affirms that one must be able to make tabula rasa of past doctrines. And so philosophy emerged from the necessary sequence of notions, and it presents the character of unity and rational interiority. So philosophy is knowledge through internal reason. And so one position could be, okay, since philosophy is knowledge through internal reason, it is not concerned with its own history, which is fake, because even if Descartes said that his philosophy was a way of create a break with tradition, so create a new philosophy. He actually knew very well ancient philosophy, and we cannot think of Descartes' philosophy without the tradition of past philosophies. So there are different attitudes. So one attitude is, okay, there is only history of philosophy and no more philosophy, or there is only philosophy and no history of philosophy. The problem for Guéraud is how do we articulate them? Okay, so here I'm describing this attitude of skepticism. The attitude of skepticism is when the historian consider that there is no truth of philosophy, so it's considering that since any philosophy is contradicting any other philosophy, we will never reach a philosophical truth. So there is no truth in philosophy, everything is relative, and so they decide to explain philosophy by external reasons. So they say, okay, the psychology of the philosopher or the sociological condition can be substituted for the analysis of the philosophical intrinsic truth. And so this is the worst thing possible for Marshall Guéraud, and is addressing here a lot of his contemporaries, saying that, okay, there is no absolute truth in philosophy, so there is no truth in philosophy, and we can explain Descartes' system because of his psychological attitude, or worse, because of his unconscious desires, or because of his events that happen in his life. So this is a way of explaining philosophy or talking about philosophy by means which are not philosophical. So this is the worst thing according to Gero. So we have two extremes. One extreme is, okay, I just consider philosophy and no history, like in Hegel. So there is no history of philosophy, but only philosophy understanding itself. And the other attitude is, okay, there is no philosophy, only history of philosophy. And this history of philosophy is involved with material history and reasons which are not internal to philosophy itself. Then, of course, there is this issue of philosophy does violence to its own history. That means that there are different ways in which philosophy is considering its own history. And depending on the way in which philosophy is considering its own history, you have different way of conceiving philosophy. So here, Marshall Gero is making the whole list of a different relation between philosophy and its own history in the past. But we are not considering this because it's really long. But you can read it if you are interested. It's really nice. History of relation of philosophy to its own past, to its historiography, and a development of the discipline of a history of philosophy. And we go to the conclusion. Okay. So here he says, okay, Hegelianism arose from these different currents, which are united in its total synthesis. A history of speculation, the history of the mind, abstract history, etc., which are the different approaches that he described above. So with Hegel, the conciliation of philosophy and its past seemed to have been achieved. The different moments in the history of philosophy identified themselves with those in the history of the mind, and these stages were only to reflect in time the eternal categories of logic. The history of philosophy translates temporally the external dialectic of the idea, while still being the very life of the absolute spirit. And so it says, then, are we at the end of our difficulties? And the answer is not at all. Because the Hegelian synthesis, in spite of its fecundity, was to collapse in turn. Infinite philosophy was devoured by its past in the Middle Ages. With Hegelianism, it is the history of philosophy which, under the pretext of being founded on philosophical reality, was swallowed up and made prisoner of philosophy. And although basing the rhythm of this progress on that of a dialectic explaining its discontinuity and catastrophic character, it imposed upon it a concept which is repugnant to the true relation between different philosophies. So it's a way of not recognizing the autonomy of any particular philosophy. Thus, the history of philosophy, which Hegelianism gave back to philosophy, regained its autonomy through the fall of Hegelianism. So, if you want to say that there is philosophy after Hegel's philosophy, we need to justify this possibility of creating a philosophy which is not part of the same history of philosophy. So he's introducing here finally this new approach, this new methodology, which emerged after what he called the collapse of Hegelian philosophy, but we still don't know if actually collapsed or not. But this is another problem. And so he says, okay, today there are two ways of addressing the history of philosophy. One tends toward the study of wide periods of movements, and the other tends toward monograph with interest in the structure of a palace of ideas. So this interest in the structure of a palace of idea is the structural approach. So the interest is in the structure, but means in the architecture of a system in itself. And so it responds to the philosophical aspect of philosophy, to the affirmation of the absolute and the unique, which is the hallmark of all philosophical doctrines. It is the technology of systems. So what Marshall Guerreau is doing is this technology of systems. And this technology of system is a way of considering the historical value of any philosophy in an autonomous way. So on the one hand, every philosophy arises from the negation of tradition as the absolute beginning born of an act of revolutionary freedom. On the other, what we call philosophy is not this or that system generated by denial of the past, but the whole past of philosophy, which constitutes a kind of cosmos of intelligible realities sui generis, mutually related to one another. Philosophy already acquired is there and nowhere else. So historical truth and scientific truth cannot dissociate themselves in philosophy as they do in science. And so the important point is that this analysis, this new analysis, this new structural analysis, need to grasp this something. It attests that any philosophy contains a something which grounds this indestructibility, and it is that something which makes philosophy's object worthy of possible history. So to grasp this something is to grasp the value of philosophy, the value which makes any philosophy an eternal truth, like a monument. The search for the nature of that truth, which, irreducible to scientific truth, establishes the various philosophies appearing in the past as objects eternally worthy of history. So now he is introducing his new discipline, which is called genomatique, which would be, with respect to philosophical monuments, the equivalent of aesthetics or transcendental theory of a possibility of work of art as possible object for art history. So there is this interesting parallel that is doing between works of art and philosophical systems. So from one point of view, a philosophical system can be compared to an artwork because it's like a monument whose value is eternal. And aesthetics is a discipline which is concerned with the possibility of works of art. So it's a way of understanding the conditions of possibility of philosophies, of philosophical systems, are objects, are walls, are as architectures. So it's a kind of transcendental questions about the conditions of possibility of creation of this philosophical reality or philosophical realities. The value of philosophy is due to the intrinsic truth, that is, to the concept that they enclose something real, born of their systematic and architectonic constitution. And so all the issue of the reasons of being and reasons of knowing is a matter of understanding the technology which allows for this architectonic constitution of philosophical systems. Then, of course, there is a problem that even though we can compare philosophical systems with works of art, because of the self-sufficiency of a system, of the autonomy of a system, we know also that artworks and the philosophical systems are not the same thing. And they're not the same thing because an artwork as is veritas in re, so in itself, it has an intrinsic value, but there is also in philosophy the need for a truth of judgment, so veritas in representando. So philosophy is not just something like a fiction, like a word of fiction which is current, okay, but it's just another word. Philosophy wants to be the construction of a word which is our own word. So it was to explain how knowledge of our reality is possible by constructing, of course, our reality according to a rational structure. So philosophy in this way is in a midway between art and science, because as art is autonomous, so it's self-sufficient, but as science, it wants to say something about our reality, wants to ground through judgments. So, and usually one philosophy wants to ground are the scientific judgments. So why scientific knowledge is possible. So it follows, therefore, that to search for the conditions which make the indestructibility of philosophy in history possible is to search for ways in which, in each philosophy, the scientific establishment of a truth of judgment makes possible the foundation of an intrinsic truth independent of any truth of judgment. So that means that the aim is to ground through judgment, but the way in which philosophy is grounding the true judgments of science, for example, is independent on science itself. So it's establishing a philosophical truth explaining the possibility of scientific knowledge, but independently on scientific knowledge, because if not, you would have that the truth of philosophy depends on the scientific theory which are approved, which are validated, depending on time. So every philosophy proceeds from a truth of judgment to the intrinsic truth by forcing itself to demonstrate the truth of a judgment bearing on the real, its nature, and its transcendental location. So the restraint imposed by the scientific demand relative to this true judgment on reality leads to the intrinsic truth by the positing of a true reality. So that means that science depends on the given, science depends on the experience, but philosophy is constructing the reality. So it's not relying on the given, but it's constructing the reality in a way that the knowledge of this reality is possible. So we have a double construction. We have a construction on the side of the being. So philosophy is positing being, it's positing reality. And we have a construction on the side of knowledge, so explaining why we have to consider that judgments are true from the logical point of view. So it's constructing on both sides, the formal and the material one. Consequently, we must suppose that since there is no reality other than that which each time is established by philosophizing thought, the latter can never ground its validity on its alleged conformity to a ready-made real anterior to its decree. So there is no ready-made reality for philosophy, but philosophy proceeds constructing a reality which is correlate to the possibility, to the power of thought, which is discovered on the other side, so on the side of the reason of knowing. Okay, so I try to go back to the screen. Okay, so that was the first text by Marshall Guéraud. And we will see in the next one about Descartes, how he actually applies this methodology. So you have any question about what we said about this first reading?
So it seems to me like there's quite a strong dialectical tension at work here, because from the point of view of the philosopher who's trying to posit some sort of new system, they probably don't want their philosophy to be considered in the way that Guéraud is going to consider it, as like something that's beautiful, given its own terms within a system, but that we can't say to be true of the external world. Every philosopher is going to want to be making claims that are in fact true about the reality that they're positing outside of their system. And so it seems like there's this sort of like implicit tension that's going on at every stage, where the philosopher who's making a new set of claims may be willing to accept that, yes, there's this intrinsic truth of every past system, and that by virtue of its coherence and its internal structure, that's what lends it its unique power. But that's something that has to be repurposed as a set of tools for something which now I'm really positing the thing that is itself true. And so it seems like that's perhaps a necessary condition for the generation of philosophies, but also something that no philosopher will want to accept of their own philosophy, what has been posited by Guéraud.
Yes. Then I think that Guéraud is really talking from a perspective which is the post-idealist world. So it's talking from in a certain way against absolute idealism. So it's trying in a certain way to repropose a Kantian perspective against the Hegelian perspective. So I think that one of the most important problem at that time in that period was, what do we do after the Hegelian system? So everybody are thinking of this impossibility of this paradox of a totalization in the Hegelian system. And so the discussion was already on the ground of there is a construction of reality. So there is no given reality, but the reality of knowledge is a constructed reality. So we are just taking for granted this assumption that there is a construction of reality. But the problem is how to escape from the issue of totalization. So I think that Guérault's strategy is how do we escape from this totalization, and is less a way of thinking about the realism of philosophy. Is just taking for granted that knowledge is a construction of reality. So there is no more realism which is possible, and I think that it also sign or a symptom of the fact that speculative realism is important, because it recall that there is a reality actually which is outside, but there is not only this construction. But of course, I think that philosophy was sort of blind to this necessity, or to this need of not positing a reality outside the philosophical construction. So of course there is a sort of idealism, and they are just fighting idealism on the side of the totalization, and they're not fighting idealism on the side of reality. Other questions?
I'm intrigued about the autonomous system that art is, and I would like to ask if you could elaborate on that a bit, because it's quite interesting as a definition.
Yeah, so it's considering philosophical systems like monuments. So it's comparing philosophical system to artworks in the sense of monuments. So objects whose value is eternal. So a work of art is an object whose value is eternal. And its value is eternal because of its internal coherence, because it's independent on the situation. So an artwork, I mean, at that time was a sort of autonomous object. So I think it's sort of a modernist conception of art. So it's of course referring to a theory of art, which is a theory of art where you have art as self-reflection of its own conditions of creation. So a work of art is autonomous because it doesn't need anything outside itself, and that makes this object not an object like everyday objects, which are whose value depends on the use, for example, or it depends on fashion, or it depends on things which are contextual things, and not here it says, okay, an artwork is an artwork forever. And even if there is a history of art, so even if there are different modalities of production of art, any work of art has a value forever. So a philosophical system is sharing this characteristic with art, which is the fact that any philosophical system is valid forever. So as a structure, as a system, as an architecture, its value does not depend on the becoming of the world, of the real world of history, but its value is in itself. It's because of internal coherence of the parts. But of course, this is not enough. And there was a big sort of debate in France at that moment. So between Marshall Guéraud and Alquer, who was another French philosopher. And actually, this French philosopher was one who explained the philosophical system by psychoanalysis, for example, or by sociological reasons. So they had a kind of discussion about Descartes, and Marshall Guéraud said, okay, Descartes' system can be explained by its internal chain of reasons. And Alquer said, no, Descartes' system can be explained from a Freudian perspective by analyzing his unconscious problems and whatever. So it can be deduced by the personality, historical personality of the author. So it's to answer to this kind of criticism. So before the issue was, okay, how do we answer to the Hegelian way of considering the history of philosophy? About the structure, like artwork structure, is to answer to the other way of making history, explaining a work because of historical, psychological, or sociological reasons. So I said, okay, in the same way as a work of art does not depend on the psychology, we can consider a work of art independently on the psychology of the artist, but just because it's an eternal coherent object. In the same way, we can explain philosophical system as internally coherent objects independently on other external causes.
Thanks very much for that explanation.
Yes, I kind of saw something about Laruelle. I think that yes, the idea of a philosophical decision is really pertinent here. Other questions? So if there are no more questions, we can try to see the other text, which is the monography on Descartes. And in this monography is kind of one of the first that he made, and is really applying this methodology, showing how Descartes built his philosophical system according to the order of reasons. Okay, so I just try to find it.
Anna, can you describe one more time? It's like Guéraud has a critique of philosophical systems, but I still haven't connected with his logic for how we can get this synthesis of the systems?
I mean, it's not a synthesis of the systems. So what it's trying to do is to show which are the conditions of possibility of philosophical systems. But to show the conditions of possibility of philosophical systems means to show the condition of possibility to create different philosophical systems which are not reducible one to each other. So,
but can they be critiqued?
Pardon?
Can they be critiqued from the other position?
No, I mean, is methodology is a way of understanding why a philosophical system is worthy of history. So, of course, it can be a critique of philosophy, but it can be a critique of philosophy not at the level of the content of a philosophy, but only at the level of the incoherence. So if the architecture is not well done, so if it's not solid, then I can criticize the philosophical system because of its lacking of coherence, because the order of reasons is not really a logical order. But there is no a critique on the side of ethic, for example, or moral implication, or it's just a formal evaluation and not an evaluation of content. So it's not saying, okay, one philosophy is better than another one. It says just a certain way of constructing a philosophical system is valid, and there are philosophies, of course, which are not valid as philosophies because they are not well constructed.
Would it be correct then to say that Gödel is always sort of taking the viewpoint of analyticity? He always wants to look at the systems insofar as they're can be understood as analytic, but he doesn't want to like pose the question of like how can we understand them in their synthetic dimension? Would that be correct?
No, I mean, there are two approaches that we are going to see, analytical one and synthetic one. So there are two ways of constructing system. One is from the formal point of view, like the Hegelian one. The Hegelian one is really formal. So you are deducing reality starting from logic. And the development of, so it is a reflection of the operation of the mind which produces reality. So this is an analytic order because, of course, you start from one concept and then you have all the other concepts unfolding. And the other way is synthetic. The synthetic order is the order starting from the reason of being that we will see, and it's valid. It's another valid way of constructing philosophical systems. Of course, we can say that Gödel is constructing the system of all the systems. And actually, I think that what Deleuze wanted to do is just this, but it's just keeping both the sides, the analytic and the synthetic side. And it says, okay, we must articulate them, but in some philosophy, we start from the reasons of being, so it's a synthetic philosophy. And on the other side, we start from a concept or an idea, and the order is analytic.
As soon as we're pronouncing on being, though, aren't we then sort of subject to the critique of Hegel that Gerold makes, where we're trying to assimilate the past philosophical systems to whatever the current system is, whatever the meta system, perhaps? And then at that point, now that we're pronouncing on whatever being is, we're no longer at the level of the concept. So it seems like there's this differentiation where we can have, like, the philosophy attempts to make synthetic judgments, but that it's, insofar as it's apprehended within Gerold's methodology, it has to be apprehended analytically. But that's what it looks like to me, but maybe I'm wrong about
that. So we are going to see the examples, because, I mean, usually we think that there is no formal approach, I mean, that there is no logical order or coherence in this synthetic way. But for example, is the difference between Descartes and Spinoza's. So what he shows is that in Descartes you start from the order of reasons, so it's really analytical because you just have to reach the first truth, the first principle, so the first clear and distinct ideas, and then you have all the chain of logical deduction, which is analytical. And it shows that in Spinoza, it's starting from the condition of existence of beings, even though we know that both Descartes and Spinoza's systems are pretending to be a mathematical system in the sense of geometrical axiomatics. So both says, okay, I'm explaining my philosophy in a geometrical way because any assumption is linked to the previous one. But even though there is this order of the reasons, the order of the reasons can be synthetic in the case of Spinoza and analytic in the sense of Descartes. Because Spinoza is starting from God and God is natural. So everything for Spinoza is existing, is generating, is explained according to his genesis from the substance, but in a geometrical way, so according to a chain of reasons, which is synthetical, of course. And in Descartes, you have the same geometrical order, but from the side of thought, because it's thought which is accessing its own conditions of possibility. So it's not starting from substance generating things, but it's starting from thought generating certainty. So there is a possibility of having a materialism on the side of the reasons of being, and a formalism on the side of the reason of knowing. But the fact is that in some way they must be connected. So in Hegel, you have also the reasons of being, which is that a concept is the object of reflection. But of course, it's not primary. but we're going to see it in the text, and I hope it will be clear. And of course, the Gero philosophy is really connected to the problem of that period, which was really the moment of the separation between continental and analytic philosophy. So it's after the collapse of Hegelian system, is taken a way which is not the way of analytic philosophy. It's more on the side of the continental, and in fact, it will be very influential on structuralist philosophy in France. So it's kind of considered the person who started the structuralism, sort of proto-structuralism in a way. Okay, so we try to do this quickly. We don't have a lot of time. So the book is Descartes' Philosophy interpreted according to the order of reasons. So it's really explaining how to apply this methodology of the historian. So in this book, Marshall Guerreau, I need to share this. Marshall Guerreau is behaving like the historian, who is applying his own methodology to past philosophy. Is showing how the good historian of philosophy should work with the text of a tradition. So first he makes this distinction between comprehension and explanation, and he says that there is comprehension of philosophy and explanation, and he wants to explain philosophy and not to comprehend this. So he said, of course, there are changes in the interpretation of past philosophy. Doubtless, the change of generation constantly varying the light that illuminates works, at times accentuates the relief of some doctrines, but display of lights leaves monument intact. It is otherwise with romanticized interpretations which pervert form and content, like the virtuoso would dare play Mozart in the style of Schumann, Chopin, or Ravel. We would say of such a person, he has no taste for philosophy. So there is this taste for philosophy, which is a way of evaluating philosophy in the right way. So evaluating philosophy, any philosophy, for what it is. And so it's a call for authenticity. There is an authenticity in any philosophy, and this authenticity depends on the rigorous linkages. So what is in this way of explaining philosophy, consider that philosophy, which is not of vain delirium, attempts to discover the key to the enigma proposed to it by the work of the great geniuses. And this text has to be explained. So starting point is that philosophy is not a delirium. So even though there are things which are obscure or difficult to be understood, the task is to explain the enigma, which is the philosophy. So there are two techniques: textual criticism and analysis of structures. Textual criticism is to consider the text with respect to the tradition, and the analysis of structure is the technique of finding, explaining how the system was built. And so it says, okay, we attempt here the objective analysis of a work. And is applied to the Cartesian meditations. And the discovery of such structures is basic for the study of any philosophy, for it is by these structures that it deserves to be entitled philosophy, in contrast to fable, poem, spiritual or mystical elevation, general scientific theory, or metaphysical opinions. These structures have as common characteristic being demonstrative, and they always consist of a process of validation. This demonstration combines logical means with architectonic means. And the architectonic elements of a philosophical work attempts to incline or compel the intelligence of the subject to a judgment ratifying the truth of the doctrinal teaching. So the structure are demonstrative. That means that they are rational in a way that can be proved. So the validity must be proven. And so the chain of reasons must be so clear that any reader should ratify the truth of a doctrinal teaching. From the point of view of the logical construction. And so he said, okay, Descartes justly has a real horror of unconnected faults. Okay, so there is a double task here. One task is to apply the structural methodology to the work of Descartes, and to show that actually Descartes constructed his philosophy according to the structural methodology. So in a way, we could say that Gero or methodology is confirmed by the systems that he is analyzing. So it's all a matter of methodology. So since there are different truths, in the sense that there are different systems of philosophy, different philosophies, the only way to establish the value of philosophy is according to the methodology, the method which is used. So there is a good method and a bad method, and a bad method fail cause us to deviate from the truth, while a good method would, without fail, bring us to it. So a better method is truly the analysis of the structures of the work. So here we have Descartes says, okay, I'm using a good methodology, so my philosophy is constructed according to a good methodology. And this good methodology is also applied by Guéraud to evaluate the good methodology of philosophical system. So, of course, there is a sort of circularity going on here. Okay, so Guéraud says Descartes insists that he follows the order of geometers, that there are no good demonstrations in philosophy that are not mathematical, and that his work cannot be understood by those who do not have mathematical mind. So Descartes, as we said, that is constructing his system according to a mathematical order, which is an analytical one. It's from the first principle to the consequences. And the most important thing for Descartes is the order of the demonstrations. So it's the sequence and the linkage of the reasons. That's why it's the order of reason. So the order of reason is this mathematical linkage and sequence of reason. So arguments which allows for support the architecture of the system. And what is important is this rational linkage. And the rational linkage is opposed to the chronological sequence of topics. So rational linkage depends on the consequentiality between truth or propositions, and it's not reflecting the chronological sequence of topics. So philosophy is not a catalog of different topics, a catalog of different themes or different items, but is the construction of a rational linkage, a rational structure. So the order of reason is just this necessary connection between the arguments, which cannot be reduced to the order of the topics. What is important is a connection. So here is describing how Descartes constructed system according to this order of reasons. So the first thing to do is to recognize that our intelligence is limited, so that there are limits of our intelligence. And Descartes says that knowledge has impassable limits, founded on the limits of our intelligence, but that within those limits, certainty is complete. So this is important, that even though our intelligence is limited, certainty is possible. So first of all, it's a matter of determining the limits of intelligence. And so the first step is a way of criticizing thinking, the power of thinking, by thinking itself. So this order of reasons is an order which is starting from an analysis of a criticism of thought, by thought itself. And the first principle is the principle which concerns the power, or the first certainty, the first clear idea that we find in thought itself, independently on anything else. So the first truth, the undoubtable truth that thought can find about itself. And so we know that Descartes starts from this idea of the cogito. So nothing can be known before intelligence, for it is from intelligence that things can be known and not conversely. So according to the order of reason, which is the order according to which Descartes constructs his system, first is the analysis of intelligence. And he says, okay, knowledge depends on intelligence, and we know better our mind than our body. So in the meditation, you have all the demonstration of this idea that we know better our mind than our bodies. It says, if any truth can be found, it can be found in our thought, which is transparent in a certain way to thought itself. So this is the starting point of a philosophical system which is constructed according to the order of reason. So the cogito is the first truth, and the first truth is about the existence of thinking, of thought. So I think, therefore I am, and then is, what am I? A thinking thing. So the first truth is the undubitable certainty of our intelligence, and all this experiment of thought, which is the cogito and the universal doubt, is made up in order to certificate this validity of the truth of thinking itself. So what is important is that according to Descartes, the first truth concerns the activity of thinking itself, and God is here the second truth. And this is really important to understand the difference. I go faster because it's almost 7. The difference between the order of reason and the order of being. So according to the order of reason, first is the truth about our intelligence. And the truth about our intelligence means that we find some ideas, clear ideas in our mind. But first we have to say, okay, we are sure that we are thinking, that thinking is operating. And so the ground of everything is this principle of being a thinking thing. And God is the second truth. God is the second truth because God is the idea, the first clear and distinct idea that we find in our mind. And from this, Descartes derived the validity of the ideas of mathematics, and from the ideas of mathematics, all the formal knowledge of reality. only the formal knowledge of reality. So it's deducing the order or the formal order of knowledge. So the relation between thoughts is constructing the formal structure of thought. So God is the reason that provides objective validity to our knowledge, because there is God, that we can be sure that mathematics is real. But once we have mathematics, we have the formal side of knowledge. So according to the reasons of being, we have to suppose that God is the first cause of being. So if we go on the other side, which is the side of reasons of being, we have another priority. So on the side of the reasons of knowing, first is the certainty about thinking. So first is the analysis of thinking in itself. On the side of the reasons of being, God, of course, is the first, because it's the cause of beings, of reality. And since the order of my ideas, the chains, the necessary chain on my ideas is different from the order of being, I need this figure of God, which makes the links between both. But God is the guarantee that the order of beings, the order of things, corresponds in a way to the order of my thought. But there are two different orders. There is an order of the logical formal system of knowledge, and another order which are the relations between real beings. And this relation between real beings are what they are because there is God, which is the cause. All possible knowledge follow from the first principles. So we have a methodology for derive certain knowledge. But then we have also to show that there is a correspondence between the order of thought and the order of being. The philosophy cannot be scientifically constituted as a unified and monolithic block of certainty in conformity with the indivisible of truth, unless it is established, like mathematics, by a rigorous chain of proposition according to the order of reason. So the construction of a wall. But we have two orders, which are the analytic order and the synthetic order. So we thought about the synthetic order, the analytic order. The synthetic order is the order which is, for Descartes, is secondary, but is the order of the creation, if you want. So it's the order according to which God is the first cause of existence, which is another kind of order. But of course, with the ontological proof, Descartes is also explaining why there is a certain order in nature. It's not only saying that the order of reasons of knowing, so the order of my formal knowledge is automatically the order of natural beings, but is saying that there is a difference between the order of my concepts and the order of nature. And the link, of course, is this existence of God. So we have to consider that God is the first cause when we are looking at the reasons of being, and that thinking itself is the first cause, if we want, according to the order of reasons. We have an order of discovery and an order of being. And it says that there is a ratio conoscendi and a ratio essendi. One is the reason to know. The order of analysis is the order of discovery of truth, and thus is the order of the ratio conoscendi. It is determined according to the requirements of our certainty, and the linkage of conditions renders it possible. The synthetic order, on the other hand, is what is established between the results of science. These results are the truth of the thing. It is therefore the order of the ratio essendi, the one according to which things are related in themselves with respect to their real dependence. So, of course, we have a methodology for science, which is the reason of knowing, which is scientific methodology. But then, of course, in order to science being possible, we need the possibility of addressing real matter. So to discover, for example, the law of nature, and the law of nature are the reasons of being. So the organization of real beings, which is not the same organization of the methodology that we apply in order to know beings. So what we know, the product of knowledge, according to Descartes, is the knowledge of the organization of real beings. And the methodology is a methodology which we can we can discover only by thought itself. But we need this synthetic application of the methodology, which is science. So the linkage of items of my knowledge is not the linkage of realities to which those items correspond. So each thing must be considered in a different order according to whether it is referred to the order of our knowledge or to the order of real existence. I think that we can stop here. Almost over. Yes. Okay, so you have any question?
It's Daryl here. We were talking in the chat. So if you undermine Descartes' first principle, and that is that you challenge the concept of cogito, it seems that by applying Garot's system, that Garot's system wouldn't allow you to do that. Because if you undermine the cogito, and a system is a chain of reasoning, then you undermine the entire system.
But it is saying that the cogito is a way of accessing the first certainty. It's constructing all the system starting from that truth.
Okay, but if it seems that there's a way to critique a philosophical system if you're consistent with Garot's approach, and that is if you went to the first principle and undermined it.
Ah, yes, of course. Yeah, but this is not the problem. So the problem is not for Garot. The problem is not the validity of a first principle, but is the validity of a chain. So of course, the first principle can be false, but what you have to do is to demonstrate, to make a demonstration. So of course, we do not believe anymore that Descartes' deduction from the first principle can be accepted. So it has been criticized a lot. But for Garot, what is important is that there is a coherence, so that the way in which he tried to force us to believe that his first principle is really a first principle can be logically assumed. So of course we can say that the first principle is not true, but we are not concerned here with Descartes philosophy, but we are concerned with the methodology which allows us to appreciate the value of a philosophy. So if we appreciate the value of the philosophy of Descartes, is because in a certain way make this effort of compelling us to accept his first principle and the whole chain. So it's just a methodology.
Okay, thanks.
So I guess one question that arises in the way that Garot is treating Descartes is whether the sort of account that he gives of the logical deduction within Descartes, is it legitimate to import this sort of axiomatic mathematical conception of the way that philosophical systems develop when they are expressed in natural language, where we can't give the sort of strict axiomatization which we can give in mathematics, because there's always going to be this sort of like necessity for implicit semantic definitions in any sort of like Cartesian deduction. So it's not subject to the same sort of strict internal logic that a formal mathematical or logical system would be.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Then the problem is that even though there is an axiomatic, we always have something outside the axiomatic. So, yeah, it's mathematical in the sense of there is a logical deduction. It's analytical. I start from a truth, and then any following truth cannot contradict the previous one.
Wouldn't that then undermine, to a certain extent, Garot's claim that we can apprehend a system purely in its internal logic, if it can't be subject to those sort of like that it is dependent on some sort of claim about a reality outside of the system. So then it can't be true that we're only looking at its internal development, because we have to assume that each move that's made in that logical deduction that Descartes claims that each move is reasonable.
No, it's not so sophisticated. I mean, what is interested interested in is really to address the methodology. So of course there are presuppositions in Descartes philosophy, and of course some terms are not perfectly defined, but the issue is not to get the perfect system. The issue is to allow for the possibility of existence of different philosophical systems. So it's not concerned in showing that Descartes philosophy is the perfect incarnation of philosophy, but in showing that is one of the possible example of a philosophical structure or architecture which is respecting the need of be generated intrinsically. So it's because of the first principle that all the machine that is generating the philosophical reality of Descartes' system is produced. So it's a way of showing how philosophy generates its own reality as knowledge of being, of real knowledge of being, how this complex correlation is generated intrinsically, starting from one principle. Then, of course, Descartes philosophy is not the perfect system, is not the only system, and I don't even think that Gero is saying that it's the perfect one. It's just an example in a way of a construction, and mostly is a way in which Gero is exemplifying his own methodology.
So let's say we find a place in Descartes where he makes an illegitimate deduction from, there's some claim and he makes another claim following it, and we can't reconstruct a legitimate way of assuming, like treating that as a consequent claim to the first one. In this case, we're not really seeking to see whether he is making a legitimate deduction, but we're more seeking to see, well, if he made this following claim, what would be the explanation for why he did that? It's something like that. Would that be right?
Yes, exactly. So it's trying to clarify and to explain the order of reason, which is in Descartes philosophy. So there is an order of reason in Descartes philosophy, so it's kind of the enigma. And the task is, how do we explain this order of reason? So why put one reason after that other, even if maybe one can object that is not. So it's a way of explaining how he built the system, and of course trying to show that there is a logical consequentiality. And of course, if it fails, if there is not, it's not a good philosophical system. So it's a methodology to verify if it is a good philosophical system. And so it's a way of verifying the Gero methodology. And he wants to show that the ambition of philosopher is to construct systems in a way that they compel the reader to believe, and reasonable reader to believe. Other questions? Okay, so we can close it for today. And don't forget to send me by email the days for your presentation, so either the third week or the fourth one, and we try to have the same number of people each day. And the presentation will be just 10 minutes, developing one of the topic, maybe also this idea of reasons of being or reasons of knowing, if you find them in other philosophies, in other fields. So if you want to criticize this Mashagero idea, or just open the discussion about this proposition of interpreting philosophies according to priority of the order of reason, so priority of the order of being. Okay, if it's okay, I say see you next week.
Can I ask quickly, is there a particular text that we should be focusing on? Because there's three quite significant ones there.
Exactly. So yes, I think that for next week, we try to see Fichte, because we have an example of which is opposite with respect to the Descartes one, which is starting from reasons of being rather than reason of knowing. So it can be used as an example of the other way around, and maybe Cohen for the same reason. And I don't think we will have a time to do the Cassirer. But of course, if you are interested in the Cassirer, you can use the text for your presentation or for your personal work. So I think that we will concentrate on Fichte and Hermann Cohen next week, if you agree.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so bye, thank you, and see you next week.
Thanks for the amazing session. See you all next week. And please remember those who have signed up for presentations that in the third week we will have those. Goodbye.